I knew my place in the family had changed the moment my daughter looked at me across the polished conference table and said, "You can leave now, Mom. This is between me and the attorney." For a second I thought I had misheard her. The words seemed too sharp, too cold to belong to the girl I had raised. The office of Harper & Lowe Legal sat on the 7th floor of a red brick building in downtown Cedar Ridge, a place my husband Robert had trusted for years. The room smelled faintly of leather and paper. Sunlight fell through the tall windows onto the long mahogany table where we had gathered only 2 weeks after Robert's funeral. My daughter Rachel sat beside the attorney as if she had already claimed the seat that once belonged to her father. She didn't even look embarrassed. She spoke the sentence calmly, like someone asking a waitress to refill a glass of water. "You can leave now, Mom." Her voice was polite, but there was something final in it. Something dismissive. Around us sat 2 assistants and a junior associate, all pretending not to notice the tension that had suddenly filled the room. I felt every pair of eyes flicker toward me and then quickly away again. I had always believed grief would be the hardest part of losing my husband. 43 years of marriage had taught me that the quiet spaces left behind by someone you love can feel enormous. But I hadn't expected humiliation to arrive so soon afterward. Robert Collins had been buried only 14 days earlier. The house still smelled like the lilies people had sent after the funeral. His reading glasses still rested on the kitchen counter where he had left them the morning before his heart gave out. And yet here we were, sitting in a lawyer's office like strangers dividing up a stranger's belongings. Rachel folded her arms and leaned back slightly in her chair, as if she had already settled the matter in her mind. "Dad always said financial matters should stay simple," she continued, glancing briefly at the attorney. "And I'm the one who handled most of those things with him toward the end." The attorney, Daniel Harper, shifted in his chair but said nothing. I had known Daniel for nearly 20 years. He had drafted the papers when Robert sold his first construction company and opened the second one that eventually funded our retirement. He had attended our Christmas dinners more than once. Now he looked at me with an expression that was carefully neutral, the way professionals learn to keep their faces when family disputes begin unfolding in front of them. I didn't answer Rachel immediately. Instead I looked down at the thin black folder placed in front of me. My name had been written neatly across the top in blue ink earlier that morning. Margaret Collins. For a moment my fingers rested on the smooth paper while my mind tried to understand how we had reached this moment. I remembered Rachel at 6 years old, running across the backyard with grass stains on her knees, shouting for her father to watch her ride her first bicycle without training wheels. I remembered the way Robert used to scoop her up when she fell asleep on the couch during movie nights. He used to call her our miracle kid, because we had waited nearly 10 years before she was born. That little girl seemed impossibly far away from the woman now sitting across the table telling me to leave. I slowly lifted my eyes and met her gaze. Rachel didn't look angry. That would have been easier to understand. Instead she looked impatient. As if my presence was simply inconvenient. "Mom," she added, lowering her voice slightly as if she were trying to sound reasonable, "this part is really just procedural. The attorney needs to discuss Dad's estate structure with me. With her. Not with us. Not with the family. Just with her." The word hung in the air like a small, deliberate wall. I noticed the way her manicured fingers tapped softly against the table while she waited for my response. Rachel had always hated waiting. Even as a child she had rushed through board games and homework assignments just to reach the end faster than everyone else. Robert used to laugh about that. "That girl's going to run a company one day," he would say. "She doesn't know how to sit still." At the time it had sounded like pride. Now the memory felt different. The attorney cleared his throat gently, perhaps hoping to soften the moment. "Mrs. Collins," he said carefully, "we can certainly review the documents together later if you prefer." Later. The word suggested something temporary, but Rachel's expression told another story. She had already decided this meeting didn't belong to me. For the first time since we entered the office that morning, I became aware of how quiet the room had become. Even the ticking wall clock seemed unusually loud. I stood up slowly, smoothing the sleeve of my navy cardigan the way I used to do before church on Sundays. No one moved to stop me. Rachel watched with the faintest hint of relief crossing her face, as if the problem had just solved itself. "If that's what you want," I said calmly. My voice surprised me. It sounded steady, almost distant. I picked up my purse from the chair beside me and walked toward the door. Each step across the carpeted floor felt strangely deliberate, like I was watching someone else perform the action. I reached the glass door and placed my hand on the metal handle. Behind me I heard Rachel shifting papers. "Thank you," she murmured to the attorney, already turning her attention back to the table. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The corridor outside the office was quiet and brightly lit, with framed certificates lining the walls. For a moment I stood there, letting the door close softly behind me. Through the frosted glass I could hear muffled voices beginning again inside the room. Rachel's voice carried the clearest tone. Confident. Assured. "Dad knew I was the responsible one," she was saying. The words drifted faintly through the glass before the conversation blurred into indistinct murmurs. I didn't move right away. Instead I looked down the long hallway toward the elevator at the far end. The building's air conditioning hummed softly above me. Somewhere in the distance a phone rang. It struck me then how quickly a lifetime can shift. Just 2 weeks earlier I had stood beside my husband's hospital bed holding his hand, believing our biggest challenge was saying goodbye. Now I was standing outside a closed door while my daughter discussed his life's work as if I had never been part of it. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder and walked slowly toward the elevator. The carpet beneath my shoes muffled each step. No one stopped me. No one called my name. And yet as the elevator doors slid open and I stepped inside, a quiet thought formed in the back of my mind, one that would not leave me for the rest of the day. Rachel believed she had just removed me from the story. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Robert Collins had always been a man who planned several moves ahead. The elevator doors closed with a soft metallic whisper and for a moment I simply stood there watching the numbers above the panel slowly count down from 7 to 1. The small mirrored walls reflected a woman I almost did not recognize. My silver hair was neatly pinned the same way I had worn it to my husband Robert's funeral 2 weeks earlier. My navy cardigan still smelled faintly of the lavender detergent I had used for years. Nothing about my appearance had changed, yet something fundamental had shifted in the quiet space between those elevator walls. Rachel had not raised her voice. She had not insulted me outright. She had simply erased me from the conversation as if I were an unnecessary footnote in the story of my own marriage. The elevator reached the lobby and the doors slid open into the cool marble entrance of the building. Outside the tall glass windows the afternoon sun stretched across Cedar Ridge like a soft golden blanket. Cars moved slowly along Maple Avenue and a city bus rolled past the corner stop. Life was continuing exactly as it always had, indifferent to the quiet fracture that had just taken place upstairs. I walked out of the building and paused on the sidewalk for a moment. Robert used to stand in this exact spot whenever he came to see Daniel Harper about contracts for his construction company. I remembered waiting in the passenger seat of our old Buick while he stepped inside for meetings that never lasted longer than an hour. Back then I had never questioned what happened in those offices. Robert handled business. I handled the home. That was the balance we had built over 43 years together. The memory felt almost unreal now. I started walking down Maple Avenue without any particular destination in mind. The October air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Cedar Ridge was not a large city. You could cross most of downtown on foot in 20 minutes. As I passed the familiar storefronts I noticed how ordinary everything looked. The bakery. On the corner displayed rows of cinnamon rolls behind its glass counter. A hardware store clerk swept dry leaves from the entrance. 2 teenagers laughed while sharing a pair of headphones near the bus stop. No one knew that a daughter had just dismissed her own mother from her father's while reading like an uninvited guest. I continued walking until I reached the small park across from the public library. Robert and I used to bring Rachel here when she was little. There had been a red swing set back then and a wooden bench where we would sit on summer evenings while she ran across the grass chasing fireflies. The swings were gone now, replaced by a modern playground with bright plastic slides. I sat on one of the benches and folded my hands in my lap, letting the quiet settle around me. For the first time that afternoon I allowed myself to replay Rachel's words exactly as she had spoken them. "You can leave now, Mom." The sentence itself had been simple. But it had carried an assumption inside it, an assumption that my presence was unnecessary in the final chapter of my husband's life. That thought lingered in my mind longer than the insult itself. Robert had never treated me like an outsider. Even during the busiest years of his company he insisted that I sit beside him whenever financial decisions were discussed at home. I could still hear his voice across the kitchen table many evenings as he reviewed paperwork while drinking black coffee long after dinner. He used to say something that sounded almost like a joke at the time. "Margaret, never forget that money changes how people behave." I remember laughing once and asking who exactly he expected to change. Robert had simply smiled and folded the documents neatly back into his leather folder. Sometimes you do not know who someone really is until there is something valuable at stake. The memory drifted through my mind like a quiet echo. At the time it had seemed like one of Robert's practical observations about business. Now it felt strangely personal. I looked across the park toward the library steps where an elderly man was reading a newspaper in the sunlight. My thoughts wandered back to the weeks before Robert passed away. His health had declined quickly that final month. Yet even in the hospital he had insisted on making several phone calls. Once I had walked into the room just as he ended a conversation with Daniel Harper. When I asked what they had been discussing, Robert simply squeezed my hand and said it was routine paperwork. I had not pressed further. After 43 years of marriage you learn when your partner wants privacy. A breeze moved through the trees above the park bench, scattering a few dry leaves across the sidewalk. I sat there longer than I realized, watching the quiet rhythm of the town continue around me. Eventually I reached into my purse and checked my phone. There were 2 missed calls from neighbors who had been kind enough to bring casseroles after the funeral. There were also 3 text messages from Rachel that had arrived earlier that morning reminding me about the will reading appointment. None of them asked how I was feeling. None of them suggested we attend together. The absence of those words suddenly felt more meaningful than the messages themselves. I slipped the phone back into my purse and leaned back against the wooden bench. For a moment I considered returning home immediately. The house on Pine Hollow Road would be quiet this time of afternoon. Robert's armchair still faced the television exactly the way he had left it. But another thought lingered in my mind, a quiet curiosity that would not disappear. Daniel Harper had looked uncomfortable when Rachel asked me to leave. He had not argued, but he had not seemed entirely surprised either. That detail stayed with me. Lawyers spend their lives navigating delicate family matters. They learn how to hide their reactions behind professional expressions. Yet something in Daniel's brief glance toward me had suggested there was more happening behind the scenes than Rachel realized. I stood from the bench and brushed a small leaf from my cardigan sleeve. The sun had begun dipping slightly lower across the rooftops, casting longer shadows across the park path. As I walked back toward Maple Avenue, I found myself remembering another small detail from the morning meeting. When the attorney placed the black folder on the table in front of me, he had written my name on it with careful precision. Margaret Collins. Not Mrs. Collins. Not simply Margaret. My full name. It had seemed like a polite formality at the time. Now it felt deliberate. By the time I reached the corner of Maple Avenue and 7th Street, I had made a quiet decision. I would not assume anything about Robert's intentions until I understood them completely. My daughter might believe she had already claimed the story my husband left behind. But Robert Collins had always been a man who disliked unfinished business. And something told me that the story Rachel was telling herself upstairs in that lawyer's office might not be the full one. By the time I reached Pine Hollow Road, the sun had lowered enough to cast long amber shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Our house stood exactly the way Robert and I had left it the morning we drove to the hospital 3 weeks earlier. The white shutters were freshly painted from the summer. The maple tree in the front yard had already begun shedding small red leaves that scattered across the walkway like pieces of confetti from a celebration that had ended too soon. I paused at the gate for a moment before stepping onto the path. For more than 4 decades this house had been the center of our life together. Every brick held a memory. Every window had once framed a moment of ordinary happiness. When I opened the front door, the familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood greeted me softly. The house was quiet in the particular way a home becomes quiet after someone important is gone. Not empty, exactly, but paused. I placed my purse on the entry table and slipped off my shoes before walking slowly toward the kitchen. Robert used to say the kitchen was the true heart of any house. It was where we talked through decisions late at night, where Rachel had done her homework while eating peanut butter sandwiches after school, where Robert had stood every morning pouring coffee into the same heavy ceramic mug he had owned since the 1980s. That mug still sat beside the coffee machine exactly where he had left it. I reached out and ran my fingers along the handle. The small chip on the rim had happened during a camping trip almost 20 years earlier. Robert refused to throw the mug away afterward. He always said that objects with small imperfections lasted longer because people valued them more. I stood there quietly for a moment, remembering the way he used to laugh when he said that. Eventually I poured myself a glass of water and carried it into the living room. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the familiar furniture arranged just as Robert preferred. His armchair faced the television near the fireplace. The leather had softened with years of use, shaped by the exact way he liked to sit with one leg crossed over the other while reading the evening news on his tablet. I sat on the sofa across from it and allowed the silence to settle around me again. Earlier that day my daughter had spoken to me as if I had no place in the decisions Robert left behind. Yet the room around me told a different story. Every corner of this house existed because Robert and I had built it together. The construction company he founded 30 years earlier had grown slowly at first. There had been difficult seasons when projects were scarce and we wondered if the mortgage payment would stretch our savings too thin. I remembered the winter when Robert spent nearly 3 months repairing roofs after a heavy snowstorm damaged half the houses in Cedar Ridge. He came home every evening exhausted, his hands rough from working outdoors in freezing temperatures. But he never complained. He simply placed his tools by the door, washed up, and asked Rachel about her day at school before sitting down for dinner. Those were the years when Robert began quietly setting money aside. He believed in preparation more than luck. Margaret, he once told me while organizing paperwork at the kitchen table, stability is not something you wait for. It is something you build piece by piece until one day you realize it is holding your entire life together. I leaned back against the sofa cushions and looked toward the hallway that led to Robert's study. He had always kept that room organized with almost obsessive care. Even when Rachel was younger, he rarely allowed anyone else to move the files stacked neatly inside the wooden cabinets along the wall. For years I had respected that boundary without question. But as I sat there that afternoon, a quiet curiosity returned to my mind. The same curiosity that had followed me since I left the lawyer's office. Robert had spoken with Daniel Harper several times during the weeks before he passed away. At the time I believed those conversations were routine business matters. Now I was no longer certain. I set the empty glass on the coffee table and stood up slowly. The hallway floor creaked softly beneath my steps as I walked toward the study door. When I pushed it open, the familiar scent of old paper and cedar greeted me. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window above Robert's desk, casting a warm glow across the shelves lined with folders and binders. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the last time I stepped into this room months earlier. Robert's desk remained perfectly organized. His favorite fountain pen rested neatly beside a stack of unopened mail. The leather desk chair stood slightly pushed back as if he had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to return soon. I walked toward the file cabinets along the far wall. Robert labeled every drawer carefully with small white tabs. Contracts. Project plans. Financial statements. The neat handwriting felt strangely comforting. When I opened the top drawer, the folders inside were arranged with the same precise order Robert used for decades. I did not know exactly what I expected to find. Perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps only confirmation that Rachel had been correct about one thing. That Robert had chosen her to manage the estate because she was more involved with the company during his final years. Yet as I closed the first drawer and moved to the second, my eyes caught a label that I had never noticed before. It read simply estate planning. The words seemed almost ordinary, yet something about them held my attention longer than the others. I hesitated for a moment before sliding the drawer open. Inside sat several neatly organized folders with dates written across their tabs. Some were from years earlier, long before Robert's health declined. Others were more recent. The most recent folder had been placed carefully at the front of the drawer. Its tab carried a date from just 6 weeks earlier. My fingers rested lightly on the edge of the folder as I considered opening it. The quiet house around me felt suddenly more watchful, as if every room was waiting to see what I would discover next. For more than 40 years I had trusted Robert's decisions without question. But now a different realization slowly settled in my mind. My husband had been a man who prepared for possibilities long before they became visible to anyone else. And if that instinct had guided him during the final weeks of his life, then the story Rachel believed she controlled upstairs in that lawyer's office might have been only the first page of something Robert had already finished writing. My fingers rested on the folder for several seconds before I finally lifted it from the drawer. The paper felt heavier than I expected, as if the weight of it carried more than just documents. I walked back toward Robert's desk and sat down slowly in his chair. The leather creaked softly beneath me, a familiar sound that instantly brought back memories of countless evenings when he sat here balancing company budgets while the television murmured quietly from the living room. For a moment I simply looked at the folder in my hands. The date written across the tab was from 6 weeks earlier, barely a month before Robert had been admitted to the hospital. I opened the cover carefully. Inside were several neatly arranged documents printed on thick cream-colored paper. Robert had always preferred that kind of paper for important files. He believed details like that showed respect for serious matters. The first page carried the letterhead of Harper and Lowe Legal. Beneath it was a formal heading that read Estate Review and Asset Allocation. I read the title once, then again, letting the words settle in my mind. Robert had updated his estate documents recently. That fact alone was not unusual. Successful business owners review their legal plans every few years. But what caught my attention was the number of pages that followed. There were far more documents than I expected for a simple update. I turned the page slowly. The next sheet listed several categories of assets tied to Robert's construction company and the properties he had acquired over the past 3 decades. Reading through the list reminded me just how much he had built over the years. What started as a small contracting operation with 3 employees had eventually grown into a regional company that handled commercial renovations across 3 counties. Robert never bragged about that success. In fact, he often avoided discussing the company's financial details even with friends. He preferred the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had built something stable for the future. As I continued reading, I noticed something else. Many of the documents had handwritten notes in Robert's familiar script along the margins. Small reminders, arrows pointing to certain paragraphs, brief comments written with the same careful penmanship he used when labeling file drawers. One note near the middle of the stack caught my eye immediately. It read simply "Review clause with Daniel." The handwriting was unmistakably his. I turned another page and felt a faint tightening in my chest as I read the heading printed across the top. Conditional distribution terms. The phrase sounded technical, almost clinical, yet the paragraphs beneath it were anything but ordinary. They described specific circumstances that would affect how Robert's estate would be divided. Certain assets would transfer automatically depending on the actions taken by the beneficiaries during the reading of the will. I read that sentence twice before continuing. The wording was precise and deliberate. Robert had clearly anticipated more than one possible scenario for that meeting in Daniel Harper's office. My eyes moved slowly down the page until I reached the final section of the document. There, beneath a line of dense legal language, a short paragraph stood out from the rest. It described a condition tied directly to the conduct of family members present at the will reading. The clause stated that if any individual attempted to exclude Margaret Collins from the official reading of Robert Collins's will, that action would trigger a revision of the asset distribution described in the primary document. I stopped reading for a moment. The room around me felt very quiet. Outside the study window a breeze stirred the branches of the maple tree in the front yard. I looked down again at the paper resting on Robert's desk. The clause continued with additional details about how the estate would be redistributed under that circumstance. The language was formal, but the meaning was unmistakable. Robert had created a safeguard. A mechanism designed to respond to a very specific situation. I leaned back in the chair slowly, letting the implications settle in my thoughts. Rachel's voice echoed faintly in my memory from earlier that afternoon. "You can leave now, Mom." The sentence had sounded casual when she spoke it, almost dismissive. Yet according to the document in front of me, that exact moment might have carried consequences she never imagined. I placed the page back on the desk and looked around the study again. 4 decades. I had believed Robert approached life in a straightforward way. He worked hard, treated people fairly, and trusted that honesty would guide the people around him. But now another side of him was becoming clear. Robert had also been observant. He noticed changes in people long before they spoke about them. He watched quietly and made plans long before anyone realized a situation required planning at all. That realization brought another memory back to me. About 2 months before Robert passed away, we had been sitting together on the back porch watching the sunset over the hills beyond Cedar Ridge. The air had been warm and calm that evening. Rachel had visited earlier that day, speaking excitedly about future projects the company might pursue once she had more control over its operations. After she left, Robert remained quiet for a long time. Eventually he turned to me and said something that felt strangely serious at the time. "Margaret, sometimes the best way to protect what you have built is to let people reveal what they truly value." I had asked him what he meant, but Robert simply smiled and squeezed my hand before changing the subject. At the time I assumed he was reflecting on business matters again. Now that conversation felt different. I looked down at the folder once more. The documents inside it were not merely instructions for dividing property. They were a map of Robert's intentions. A quiet system designed to respond to choices that had not yet been made when he wrote them. And earlier that afternoon, without realizing it, Rachel had already made one of those choices. For a long time I remained seated in Robert's chair, staring at the paragraph that described the clause he had written with such deliberate precision. The quiet study around me seemed to hold its breath while I tried to fully understand what I had just read. Robert had anticipated the possibility that someone might attempt to remove me from the will reading. Not only anticipated it, but planned for it. That realization settled slowly into my thoughts like a stone sinking through still water. I looked again at the date printed at the top of the page. 6 weeks earlier. At that time Robert had still been walking around the house every morning with his usual routine, checking the mailbox, reviewing work emails at the kitchen table, discussing small renovation ideas he wanted to finish before winter. Yet during those same weeks he had also been quietly preparing for a situation that might unfold after he was gone. I turned the page carefully and continued reading. The following document described how the estate would be handled under what Robert referred to as the standard distribution structure. In that version of events, the company's shares, several investment accounts, and 2 commercial properties would pass primarily to Rachel. There were provisions for me as well, including the house on Pine Hollow Road and a long-term financial trust designed to ensure I would never worry about monthly expenses. It was generous and thoughtful, exactly the kind of plan Robert would create for a peaceful family transition. But the document did not end there. The next section outlined an alternative distribution that would activate if the conditional clause had been triggered. The wording was technical, but the meaning was unmistakable. If a beneficiary attempted to exclude Margaret Collins from the official reading of the will, the structure of the inheritance would change significantly. Certain assets originally designated for Rachel would instead be transferred into a protective trust overseen by the estate executor. I leaned forward slightly as I read the details more carefully. The executor named in the document was Daniel Harper. That meant the lawyer who had quietly watched the events unfold earlier that afternoon already knew exactly what this clause meant. My mind returned to the moment Rachel asked me to leave the room. I remembered the brief glance Daniel had given me across the table. It had lasted only a second, but now I understood it differently. He had not been surprised by what Rachel said. He had been waiting to see whether it would happen. I closed the folder for a moment and rested my hands on the desk. The room felt different now, as if Robert's quiet presence still lingered among the shelves and papers. For decades he had approached business decisions with a calm patience that often surprised the people around him. Contractors sometimes assumed Robert was slow to react when negotiations became tense. But those who worked with him long enough eventually learned the truth. Robert did not rush decisions because he was already several steps ahead. He preferred to observe carefully before making a move. As I sat in his study that afternoon, I realized he had applied that same patience to something far more personal than business. He had been watching Rachel change. I thought back over the past 2 years, remembering moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. Rachel had begun visiting the office more frequently after Robert's health first declined. She asked detailed questions about company contracts and investment portfolios. She insisted that Robert teach her how the financial systems worked. At first I believed she was simply preparing to help manage things if Robert needed assistance. But gradually her tone shifted. Her conversations with Robert became more focused on control rather than cooperation. I remembered one evening when she sat at the kitchen table reviewing spreadsheets on her laptop while Robert listened quietly. Rachel had said something that stayed with me long after she left that night. "Dad, once the company is under my direction we can restructure a lot of these outdated arrangements." Robert had not argued with her. He simply nodded and asked a few careful questions about her ideas. Later that evening, after Rachel drove home, Robert remained seated at the table longer than usual. When I asked if something was bothering him he gave a small thoughtful smile and said he was just considering the future. At the time I assumed he meant the future of the business. Now I realized he had been thinking about something much larger. I opened the folder again and turned to the final page of the document stack. At the bottom of the page Robert's signature appeared beside the date. Beneath it was Daniel Harper's signature as the witnessing attorney. The ink looked slightly darker than the rest of the text, as if Robert had pressed the pen firmly against the paper when signing it. I traced the line of his signature gently with my eyes. Robert Collins had never been careless with the things he built. Not his company, not his family, and certainly not the plans he left behind. Outside the study window the sky had begun shifting toward evening. The golden sunlight that filled the room earlier was slowly fading into a softer blue. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back on the desk in front of me. Earlier that afternoon Rachel believed she had secured control over the story Robert left behind. She had spoken with complete confidence in that lawyer's office, convinced that removing me from the conversation would simplify everything. But the document resting on Robert's desk told a very different story. Without realizing it, Rachel had already stepped directly into the situation Robert prepared for. And somewhere across town Daniel Harper was almost certainly aware that the next move in this quiet chain of events would not belong to my daughter at all. I remained seated in Robert's study long after the light outside began fading into evening. The quiet inside the house had a different weight now, as if the walls themselves had quietly revealed a secret that had been waiting patiently to be discovered. The folder still rested on the desk in front of me, its cream-colored pages containing the careful plans my husband had written weeks before he died. I read the conditional clause again slowly, making sure I had not misunderstood even a single sentence. The language remained clear. If any beneficiary attempted to exclude Margaret Collins from the official reading of the will, the estate distribution would change according to the secondary structure described in the following documents. Earlier that afternoon my daughter Rachel had done exactly that. She had looked across a conference table and calmly told me to leave the room. At the time it felt like a moment of humiliation. Now I understood it was something else entirely. It had been the exact situation Robert had prepared for. I closed the folder gently and leaned back in the leather chair. Robert had always believed that people eventually reveal who they are when responsibility and money enter the same conversation. I remembered him saying those words years ago while reviewing financial reports at the kitchen table. At the time it sounded like a general observation about business partners. Now it felt like something much more personal. A quiet warning perhaps, spoken long before either of us realized how important it would become. The study clock on the wall ticked steadily as the evening shadows grew longer. Outside, the porch light near the driveway switched on automatically as the sky darkened. I sat there thinking about the look on Daniel Harper's face when Rachel asked me to leave the will reading earlier that day. It had not been surprise. It had been recognition. Daniel already knew about the clause Robert had written. That meant he had been waiting to see whether the condition would actually occur. My thoughts returned to the moment in the conference room when Rachel spoke those words. The way she leaned back confidently in her chair. The way she spoke to the attorney as if the meeting already belonged to her. At that time I believed I had simply been dismissed from an uncomfortable conversation. Now I understood something very different had taken place. Rachel had unknowingly triggered a legal safeguard Robert had carefully designed. I stood from the chair and walked slowly to the study window. The front yard was quiet under the porch light. A few leaves moved across the driveway in the gentle evening breeze. For decades Robert and I had built our life inside this house step by step. We raised our daughter here. We celebrated birthdays, holidays, and small victories that most people outside our family would never notice. Robert believed stability came from patience and careful planning. Looking back now, I realized he had followed that principle even in his final decisions. He had not argued with Rachel about her growing desire to control the company. He had not confronted her directly about the tone her conversations sometimes carried. Instead he had done what he always did when facing uncertainty. He prepared quietly. I walked back to the desk and placed the folder neatly beside Robert's fountain pen. The next step was suddenly clear in my mind. Daniel Harper needed to know that I had read these documents. If the clause had already been triggered during the will reading earlier that afternoon, then the legal process surrounding the estate would already be changing. Daniel was the executor named in the paperwork. That meant he was responsible for ensuring Robert's instructions were followed exactly as written. I reached into my purse and removed my phone. For a moment I hesitated before unlocking the screen. It was not fear that made me pause. It was the strange realization that everything that happened next had already been anticipated weeks earlier by the man whose chair I had just been sitting in. Robert had always been thoughtful about timing. He rarely acted too early or too late. He waited for the exact moment when action would matter most. Earlier that afternoon Rachel believed she had taken control of the situation by asking me to leave that room. In reality she had done something very different. She had confirmed Robert's final concern about the direction our family might take after he was gone. I opened my phone contacts and scrolled until I found Daniel Harper's number. My finger rested lightly on the screen for a second before I pressed the call button. The phone rang once, then twice. On the third ring Daniel answered. His voice sounded calm, almost as if he had expected the call. "Good evening, Mrs. Collins." For a brief moment I considered how to begin the conversation. But Robert had always believed in speaking plainly when the time for action arrived. "Daniel," I said slowly, "I believe we need to talk about the documents Robert prepared 6 weeks ago." There was a short pause on the other end of the line, not long enough to be awkward, but long enough to confirm something important. When Daniel spoke again his tone had changed slightly, becoming more formal and attentive. "I was wondering when you might reach out," he replied quietly. I looked down at the folder resting on the desk in front of me. The pages inside it contained the final instructions Robert had left behind, instructions that had already begun unfolding the moment Rachel told me to leave that conference room. "I think it would be best if we meet tomorrow morning," Daniel continued. "There are several details we should review together now that the reading earlier today did not proceed exactly as originally planned." I nodded even though he could not see me. "Yes," I said calmly. I believe Robert anticipated that possibility. Daniel's voice softened slightly on the other end of the call. "He did, Mrs. Collins. More carefully than most people would imagine." When the call ended I placed the phone back on the desk beside the folder. The house remained quiet around me, but the silence no longer felt uncertain. Somewhere across Cedar Ridge my daughter was likely convinced that she had already secured control over the future Robert left behind. She had walked out of that office believing the story was hers to direct. But as I turned off the light in the study and stepped into the hallway, one thought settled firmly in my mind. The story Rachel believed she had won was only beginning to unfold. I woke early the next morning before the sun had fully risen above the rooftops of Cedar Ridge. For years, Robert had been the first one awake in our house, moving quietly through the kitchen while the coffee machine hummed and the morning news murmured softly from the television. That morning the house was still silent, but the familiar rhythm of the routine remained in my memory. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Robert used to review his paperwork. The folder from his study rested beside my mug, its pages carefully arranged exactly the way I had left them the night before. I read the conditional clause one more time while the first light of morning slipped through the kitchen windows. The words had not changed overnight, but their meaning had settled more firmly in my mind. Rachel had unknowingly activated the safeguard Robert placed inside his estate plan. What remained now was the legal process that would follow. At 9 o'clock sharp I drove downtown toward the Harper & Lowe office. The streets of Cedar Ridge were just beginning to fill with weekday traffic. Delivery trucks rolled slowly past the storefronts along Maple Avenue and the bakery on the corner had already opened its doors to the morning crowd. Everything looked ordinary, the same quiet town Robert and I had lived in for most of our marriage. Yet as I parked outside the red brick building where Daniel Harper worked, I felt a calm certainty that the meeting ahead would change the direction of everything Rachel believed had already been decided. Daniel greeted me personally in the reception area when I stepped inside. He looked exactly the same as he had the day before, his gray suit neatly pressed and his expression composed in that professional way attorneys learn after years of handling complicated family matters. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," he said gently, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming in so early." I followed him down the hallway toward the same conference room where the will reading had begun the previous afternoon. The door opened into the quiet space with the long mahogany table at its center. Sunlight from the tall windows illuminated the polished surface where Rachel had sat with such confidence only hours earlier. Daniel closed the door behind us and motioned for me to take a seat. I placed the folder from Robert's study on the table and slid it toward him. "I believe this is what you were waiting for me to find," I said calmly. Daniel looked down at the documents without surprise. "Yes," he replied after a moment. "Robert wanted to make sure you understood everything when the time was right." I watched as he opened the folder and carefully reviewed the pages. His eyes moved slowly across the legal language as if confirming each detail against the official records already stored in his office. After several seconds he placed the papers back on the table and folded his hands together. "Your husband prepared these instructions with extraordinary care, Mrs. Collins. We spent several meetings discussing the possibility that the estate reading might not proceed in a respectful manner." I nodded quietly. Robert believed people reveal their priorities when money becomes part of the conversation. Daniel allowed a faint thoughtful smile to appear. "That sounds exactly like something he would say." He then reached into his briefcase and removed another document. "This," he explained, "is the official record of yesterday's meeting. It notes that you were asked to leave the room before the reading began. According to the clause your husband wrote, that action triggered the conditional distribution structure immediately." I studied the page he placed in front of me. The language was precise and formal, but the meaning remained simple. Rachel's decision had already altered the inheritance Robert originally planned. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair before continuing. "There will need to be another formal meeting," he said. "All beneficiaries must be present when the estate executor explains the revised terms. That meeting will take place tomorrow afternoon." I understood immediately who would be sitting at that table. Rachel would arrive expecting to hear the details of the inheritance she believed she had secured. Instead she would hear the consequences of the choice she made the day before. Daniel closed the folder and slid it gently back toward me. "Your husband trusted that this process would protect you," he said quietly. He also believed it would reveal something important about the people involved. For a moment the room remained silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Robert had always believed patience allowed truth to surface naturally. Yesterday my daughter believed she had removed me from the story of his estate. Tomorrow she would learn that the story Robert left behind had never belonged to her in the first place. When I stepped outside the office building again, the morning sun had fully risen above the city streets. People hurried along the sidewalks carrying briefcases and coffee cups as another ordinary workday began in Cedar Ridge. I stood for a moment beside my car looking toward Maple Avenue where traffic flowed steadily through the intersection. Somewhere across town Rachel was likely continuing her day with complete confidence in the future she believed was already secured. But Robert Collins had spent his entire life building plans that unfolded quietly and precisely when the moment arrived. And now, less than 24 hours after Rachel asked me to leave that conference room, the plan he left behind was moving forward exactly as he intended. The following afternoon the conference room at Harper & Lowe looked almost exactly the same as it had the day before, yet the atmosphere felt completely different to me. The long mahogany table reflected the soft afternoon sunlight coming through the tall windows, and the leather chairs were arranged neatly around it as if nothing unusual had ever happened there. Daniel Harper stood near the head of the table organizing several documents into careful stacks. When I entered the room he greeted me with a quiet nod, the kind of acknowledgement shared between two people who understood that the next hour would reveal more truth than most families ever expect to confront. I took a seat near the middle of the table and folded my hands calmly in front of me. A few minutes later the door opened and Rachel walked in with the same confident stride she had carried the day before. She wore a fitted gray blazer and carried a slim leather portfolio under her arm, the kind of professional appearance she often adopted when discussing business matters related to the company. When she noticed me already seated at the table her eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise, though the expression quickly shifted into polite composure. "Mom," she said lightly, "I thought Daniel explained yesterday that this part of the process would mostly involve the financial structure." Daniel closed the folder in front of him and gestured calmly toward the remaining chairs. "Please take a seat, Rachel. There are several important details that need to be clarified for everyone involved in the estate." Rachel sat down across from me and placed her portfolio neatly on the table. Her posture carried the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the outcome of the meeting had already been decided in her favor. I watched her for a moment and felt a quiet realization settle in my thoughts. Robert had been right about one thing above all others. People reveal their true priorities not through arguments, but through the small assumptions they make when they believe no one is watching closely. Daniel adjusted his glasses and opened the official estate file in front of him. As executor of Robert Collins' estate, he began in his steady professional voice, "It is my responsibility to ensure that the instructions left by Mr. Collins are followed exactly as written." Yesterday's meeting was intended to begin the formal reading of the will. However, certain events occurred that require clarification before we proceed further. Rachel leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing her arms with mild impatience. "I am sure we can move through the paperwork quickly," she said. "My father already explained most of the structure to me before he passed away." Daniel looked up at her calmly. "Your father did explain the general estate plan," he replied. "What he did not explain were the conditional provisions attached to that plan." Rachel frowned slightly. "Conditional provisions?" Daniel turned a page in the document and slid a printed sheet across the table so both of us could see it clearly. 6 weeks before his passing, Robert Collins updated his estate documents to include a clause regarding the conduct of beneficiaries during the will reading process. Rachel glanced at the paper with a quick dismissive motion. "I do not see why that would matter." Daniel folded his hands on the table. "The clause states that if any beneficiary attempts to exclude Margaret Collins from the official reading of the will, the distribution structure of the estate changes immediately." The room became very quiet. Rachel looked from the paper to Daniel with visible confusion. "I did not exclude anyone," she said quickly. "I simply suggested that Mom did not need to sit through the financial details." Daniel's voice remained calm and measured. "The clause does not address intention. It addresses the action itself." According to the record of yesterday's meeting, Margaret Collins was asked to leave the room before the reading began. That action activated the conditional structure written by your father. Rachel stared at him for a moment as the meaning slowly began settling into her expression. "What exactly does that mean?" she asked. Daniel opened another document and read carefully from the page. Under the standard estate plan, the majority of company shares and investment assets would have transferred directly to Rachel Collins. However, the conditional clause modifies that arrangement. Those assets are now placed into a protective trust managed by the estate executor. Rachel's posture stiffened immediately. A trust? Daniel nodded slightly. The trust is designed to preserve the company and financial holdings under professional oversight. Margaret Collins remains the primary beneficiary of the trust income for the duration of her lifetime. Rachel looked across the table at me with disbelief written plainly across her face. You cannot be serious. Daniel continued calmly, as if reading the terms of an ordinary contract. Your father included an explanation within the legal notes attached to this clause. He believed that respect for family members should remain a fundamental condition of inheritance. Rachel pushed the document slightly away from her as if the words themselves had become difficult to accept. This is ridiculous. Dad trusted me to run the company. Daniel met her gaze evenly. Your father trusted you to demonstrate the judgment required to inherit it directly. The room remained silent after those words. Outside the tall windows, the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge continued moving through an ordinary afternoon. Cars passed along Maple Avenue and pedestrians walked beneath the autumn trees without the slightest awareness that inside this conference room a carefully planned truth was unfolding exactly as Robert Collins intended. I sat quietly while Rachel looked again at the document on the table. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by a stunned stillness that seemed almost unfamiliar on her face. For years she had believed the company and its future would naturally pass into her hands. Yet Robert had always been a man who believed that responsibility must be proven rather than assumed. Daniel closed the file and placed both hands calmly on the table. The trust will preserve the company and its assets exactly as Mr. Collins instructed. Margaret Collins retains full residential rights to the Pine Hollow property and receives the primary financial distribution from the estate trust. Rachel said nothing. She simply stared at the documents in front of her as if they had rewritten the future she expected only. A day earlier. I watched her quietly, remembering the moment she told me to leave the room 24 hours before. At that time she believed she had simplified the story Robert left behind. But the truth Robert understood better than anyone else was simple in its own way. Sometimes the most important decisions people make are the ones they believe no one will remember. For several seconds after Daniel finished speaking, the room remained so quiet that the faint ticking of the clock on the conference room wall seemed unusually loud. Rachel stared at the documents in front of her as though the words might rearrange themselves if she waited long enough. Her earlier confidence had vanished completely. The calm certainty she carried into the room had been replaced by a stillness that looked unfamiliar on her face. I did not speak immediately. Instead, I allowed the silence to settle, the same way Robert often did during difficult negotiations. He used to say that people reveal their real thoughts in the quiet moments after they realize something has not gone the way they expected. Rachel finally looked up from the papers and turned toward Daniel. There must be some mistake, she said, though her voice no longer carried the sharp authority it had the day before. Dad would never remove me from the company like this. Daniel folded his hands calmly on the table. Your father did not remove you from the company, Rachel. He placed the company into a trust structure designed to preserve it under professional oversight. The trust will operate exactly as your father instructed. Rachel shook her head slowly. That is not what he told me. He said I would be responsible for the future of the business. Daniel's tone remained measured and steady. Your father believed responsibility should be demonstrated through actions. The clause he included was intended to ensure that the people entrusted with his legacy understood the importance of respect and judgment. Rachel looked toward me then, her expression a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Mom, you cannot seriously support this. You know Dad wanted me involved in the company. I met her gaze calmly across the table. Robert did want you involved, I replied quietly. But involvement and control are not the same thing. Rachel leaned forward slightly, as if trying to regain the authority she had carried into the room. Earlier. This is not fair. One misunderstanding yesterday should not determine the entire structure of the estate. Daniel opened another page in the file and read directly from the document. The clause states clearly that the exclusion of Margaret Collins from the will reading constitutes a violation of the conditions your father established. The legal effect is automatic and cannot be reversed without the agreement of the executor and the primary beneficiary. Rachel stared at the page again. The room fell silent once more. Outside the large windows the afternoon sunlight had shifted slightly lower across the buildings of Cedar Ridge. The same streets that looked ordinary yesterday continued their quiet routine, completely unaware of the moment unfolding inside this office. I watched Rachel carefully. For most of her life she had been confident in her ability to shape outcomes to her advantage. Robert admired that determination when she was younger. He often said that ambition was not a flaw as long as it remained balanced by humility. But somewhere over the past few years that balance had begun to change. Rachel finally spoke again, though her voice was quieter now. I only asked Mom to leave because I thought the meeting would focus on financial details. Daniel nodded slightly. Your father anticipated that explanation might be offered. That is why the clause addresses the action rather than the intention behind it. I could see the moment the meaning of those words fully settled in her mind. Robert had not reacted emotionally to the changes he noticed in Rachel over the years. Instead he had done what he always did when something important was at stake. He created a structure that allowed actions to speak for themselves. Rachel slowly leaned back in her chair and looked down at the documents again. The determination that once defined her expression had faded into something more uncertain. For the first time since the meeting began she seemed unsure of what to say next. Daniel closed the estate file gently. The trust will ensure the company continues operating according to the principles Robert Collins established over the past 3 decades, he said. The structure also guarantees Margaret Collins long-term financial security and residence in the Pine Hollow property. Rachel did not respond immediately. She simply looked across the table at me, searching for something in my expression that might offer a different explanation than the one written on the pages in front of her. But the explanation had already been written weeks before Robert passed away. And the moment that determined everything had happened less than 24 hours earlier, when Rachel asked me to leave the room. I stood slowly from my chair and gathered the folder Daniel had returned to me. For a moment I looked at Rachel, remembering the small girl who used to run across our backyard chasing fireflies on summer evenings. That memory felt very far away now. Your father believed respect mattered more than control, I said quietly. That was the lesson he wanted this process to reveal. Rachel lowered her eyes again. The confident businesswoman who entered the conference room earlier that afternoon seemed to have disappeared somewhere between the first document Daniel read and the final sentence of the clause Robert wrote. I turned toward the door and paused briefly before leaving the room. Daniel remained seated at the table organizing the papers with careful precision, the same way Robert used to arrange his files after finishing an important project. Outside the building the air had cooled slightly as the afternoon drifted toward evening. I stepped onto the sidewalk and looked down Maple Avenue where cars moved steadily through the intersection beneath the turning autumn leaves. Cedar Ridge looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The bakery on the corner still displayed fresh bread in its front window. People still walked along the sidewalks carrying grocery bags and coffee cups. Life in the town continued without noticing that a carefully planned truth had just revealed itself inside a quiet conference room. As I walked toward my car I felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over me. Robert had spent his life building things that lasted. Homes, businesses, and a future meant to protect the people he cared about. In the end he had protected something else as well. The principle that the foundation of any family is not ownership or control. It is respect. And sometimes the clearest way to reveal that truth is simply to give people the opportunity to show who they really are.